I have always loved the idea of Topsy Turvy dolls. That's a doll that has two personalities, and the skirt causes the change to take place. It covers one personality when you flip the skirt down and reveals the other. So I thought it would be lots of fun for us to make one on the knitting machine. This pattern will work for any gauge of knitting machine. The difference is that you will get different sizes of doll. Just choose a yarn that knits well in stockinette. Don't worry overly about the gauge, but these are the sizes you are likely to get at each gauge. All of these are perfectly good sizes for dolls. In addition to the yarn, you will need a little bit of lace and a little bit of fabric. Here is the length of fabric and the length of lace that you will need in each gauge. These will be used to make the skirt, and there will be a fold at the bottom of the skirt, so it's actually double layered. The lace is at the top of the skirt, and it's how we will hang the skirt on the machine so as to knit it right into the project. The length of the lace and the fabric goes around the circumference of the skirt. The width of the fabric goes from the waist to the fold and back up to the waist on the other layer of the fabric. Here are the approximate widths that will be needed for each gauge. These are based on getting a gauge in the middle of what the machine will do. If you would like to figure it precisely based on your gauge, divide 66 by your actual row gauge, the exclamation mark in the picture. Multiply the result times 2 and add 1. That will give you the width in inches that your piece of fabric should be cut. Use a sewing machine or hand sew, it doesn't matter, the lace to one of the long edges of your piece of fabric. Here I was able to sew to the selvage edge, which is great for saving a little bit of bulk. Do select a lace similar to this one with lots of built-in holes and extend those holes over the edge of the fabric. Once the lace is sewn all along one edge of the fabric, fold the fabric, turn under the raw edge, and sew the second edge right on top of the first edge, still leaving the lace exposed. Set the skirt aside. We'll need it in just a few minutes. Bring forward 50 needles and weave the color for the first piece of hair over and under those needles for a manual weaving cast on. When that's done, thread the yarn into the carriage. Make sure that the carriage is set to knit back from hold and knit the first row. I generally bring the needles forward for 2 or 3 rows to begin every row from hold. Then I can get the claw weights on, and that saves lots of drop stitches. Including all of the rows knitted, make 12 rows in this first piece of hair color, and then change yarns to face color. Knit 24 rows in the face color. Get a piece of face color yarn 3 times the width of the present knitting and weave that yarn over and under the working needles, bringing them all forward to facilitate the process. This is just the same way that we cast on, and what we're doing here is creating a drawstring that will eventually become the neck. Now change to the dress color for the first dress, and knit 30 rows. Now it's time to hang the skirt, and this is why we wanted those holes in the lace. Hang one, fold over, hang the next one as it falls in the correct position. Fold over, so 2 more holes end up on the needle that holds the first one. We're making pleats in a way. And keep repeating that process across the work. Don't put any stress on the needles. Just let the needle go through the next convenient hole as the fabric falls. You may end up with a little extra fabric. I allowed for that because it's a lot better to have a little bit more rather than a little bit less than you need. Work all the way across in the same manner. After everything is hung, bring all the needles forward so that we can resume knitting. You may not have a piece of lace hung on every needle or a lace hole hung on every needle, but every needle should now come forward to keep the lace from catching in it when we proceed. You may be able to knit back from hold with the carriage. I often do. This lace, although ideal in most respects, is a little bit stiffer than I would like. Because of that, the carriage was unsuccessful at knitting it. No problem. We just start on the left, leaving the carriage at the right, and manually knit the first row. After the manual row is knitted, change to dress color number 2, thread that into the carriage, and knit 30 plain rows. As always, whenever there's the slightest bit of challenge, in this case there's still lace right up underneath the knitting, it can be very helpful to bring the needles all the way forward and knit back from hold. It just reduces the stress on the machine because we've done half of the work. Now, with another strand of face color yarn, weave over and under every needle, just as we did at the bottom of the first face to create the neck. We'll create a drawstring for the second neck in the same manner. Thread the yarn into the machine, knit 24 face colored rows. Change to hair color number 2 and knit 12 rows. Snip the yarn, leaving a good long tail, and use that tail to gather off the live stitches, and that will be the top of the second head. Newer machine knitters, take note. I'm showing you 2 different ways to gather off using a double eye needle. The one you're seeing now is probably the faster of the 2. But the one where you pick up 1 stitch at a time onto the needle and pull it through is the least likely to drop stitches. Pull the drawstring in at the top of one head only, secure it. The purl side of this doll is the right side, the one we're going to look at. So place the fabric from the skirt to one top of the head with the knit side showing and the skirt sticking out below, and seam the edges together. Backstitch is a good choice. The yarn tails may be used for these short pieces of seam in each color. Now stuff the skirt inside the half of the doll that has already been seamed. Seam the second half of the doll in the same manner, but it's super important that you not draw in the top of the second head because that's our only access from this point on. When the second half is seamed, turn the doll right side out so the skirt is on the outside and both ends of the doll are showing the purl side of the knitting. While seaming, be careful not to get confused and use the drawstrings that we'll be using for the neck shortly in order to seam, because we'll need those to be drawstrings to define the neck. Now it's time to create the face with either buttons or embroidery or fabric markers. Be sure that anything you sew on, including embroidery, is well knotted and secured on the inside for safety. Where there's excess in the skirt circumference, trim off all but about 1 inch of it. Turn the raw edges in on each edge, stitch them closed, then overlap the layers and stitch them to one another, working between the layers so the stitching won't show on the opposite side of the skirt. When you reach the bottom of the skirt, stitch the overlap together at the hem. Then stitch on up the skirt, doing the same thing as was done stitching down the skirt on the other side. It will feel different because the overlap's in the opposite direction, but still slide the needle between the layers of the skirt so as to anchor it invisibly. Now use fiber fill to stuff the doll starting from the open end, the head that's not closed yet. Get it all evenly distributed inside. When the stuffing is complete, close the top of the head. Now is the time to pull the drawstrings in to define the neck. You've got some judgment call available about how snug you want it for different looks. If there's extra length to the yarn, you can reinforce the neck by wrapping it around before tying it off and burying the yarn tail. If the doll is for an infant, it can be done now. It doesn't really need more decoration, but we can proceed to knit hair if we want to. For the blonde hairdo, cast on 36 stitches, knit 50 rows or more if you want to, and bind off. We'll use the naturally curling cast on and bound off ends to define the bangs at the front of the head and the flip at the back of the hair. Align the front of the hairpiece so that it covers the line between the face color and the hair color, and lift it over the top of the head to the back of the neck, and then sew everything in place as it lies, except for right at the top where the fold of the front and back can touch each other. Before sewing the two layers together at the front and the back to join the piece of hair, run the needle and yarn along the edge in and out and treat it as a gathering thread so as to make the curve of the head. Then stitch the front of the hair to the back of the hair and all of it to the doll. You can stitch as much or as little as you like for looks, keeping in mind who the doll will be for. If it will get played with a great deal by a young child, more stitching is better. Secure the yarn tails, push them through the doll, and then trim them off. Make a hair bow if you want by pulling a few strands of yarn right through the top of the hair, making a little bow and trimming the ends. The long braid that will make the grandma hair is 24 strands of yarn. Use 2 1/4 yards for the standard gauge, 3 1/2 for mid gauge, and 5 for bulky. If we don't need it all, it's better to have more than enough. Knot the strands together. You can use the gate pegs to help you. Hang the knot on the gate pegs and make a 3-strand braid. Each strand has 8 strands of yarn. Right over center group, left over center group, over and over. Move the existing braid up as needed and keep on going until you reach the end of the yarn. Knot the tails together to secure them. You don't have to trim it right yet because you may handle it different ways depending on the exact hairstyle you make. Position one of the knots at the end of the braid at the nape of the neck. Bring the braid up, wrap it twice around the head, covering the line where the hair color and face color join, and stitch the braid to the doll. From there, you can twist and turn the braid around and around to cover the remainder of the back of the head in any style configuration that you want. The main thing is to get the braid securely attached in something that looks reasonable and to completely cover the back of the head so that it doesn't look like there's exposed scalp. An optional touch is to embroider the little strands of yarn that are actually forward towards the face on most people. So now the doll has 2 characters, 2 faces, 2 hairdos, a dress, and she can be finished, or we can continue on and make arms. The ordinary arms shown on the grandma are made by casting on 14 stitches and knitting 50 rows of dress color. Change to the color used for the skin, knit 10 rows. Change back to dress color and knit another 50. Bind off. Skin color section goes in front of the body. Wrap the arms around to the back of the body, and with the knit side as the right side, sew the edges, the cast on and the bind off, to the center back seam. The natural curl of the fabric will create the illusion that towards the front of the body, the arms are round, as arms actually are. Besides sewing down the center back seam, flatten the arm and the neckline area and sew it a little bit around the neckline. Thread the yarn tails from the hands one at a time into a yarn needle. Run them along the edge of the work so they are in the center of the hands. Then wrap the hands at the center a couple of times. Knot the yarn, bury the yarn tail, and that will create the illusion of 2 hands. For the second doll, you may knit the arms in the same way to match her dress, or make a little cardigan like this one. The cardigan is knitted like this. Cast on 36 stitches with E-wrap, Knit 12 plain rows, hang the E-wraps on the working needles to close the hem, knit 30 additional rows and bind off. Now turn the knitted piece sideways, as the sleeve position is marked in this diagram, and hang it as it falls on 14 needles. We'll now knit on the sleeves and the hands. Hang the work on the machine in such a way that you are looking at the purl side. Knit 24 rows of garment color, 10 rows of hand color, and another 24 rows of garment color. This is the shape we have knitted. Now I'm going to turn it on its side so you can see it better. Here's the main part of the sweater. First sleeve, hands, second sleeve. Bind off after the second sleeve and follow the arrow in the chart to sew the second sleeve to the opposite side of the garment from the first sleeve. Divide the hands just as for the plain sleeves. Slip the garment onto the doll and sew it all around the edges. The back neckline, you'll want to gather in the top edge of the sweater just a little bit. This is another good stopping place. Any child could enjoy the doll, but if we want, we can add a shawl to the grandma half. To do that, cast on 30 stitches and knit 120 rows. You may want to stop every 30 or 40 rows so as to work the edging a little along. It can be done all at once, but it's a little easier to do it in sections. To do it, ladder down stitch number 3 from each edge. Ladder down to the 4th row that was knitted. Leave the bottom 3 rows and the top 3 rows alone. They'll be part of the curled edge. Catch the next rung of the ladder, put it on the tool. Now slide the tool behind one, grab the second rung, pull through, slide behind one, grab the second one, and pull through. And repeat that action all the way up. What we're doing is creating a column of tucked purl stitches, which will make a nice neat edge and control the rolling as much as we need it to do for a doll shawl. Repeat this up both sides of the work for the entire length, except for knit the last 3 rows plain and then bind off. Wrap the shawl around the doll just as if she was really wearing it and tack it down with the shawl color of yarn every place you think it needs it. The arrows mark the positions that I used to tack the shawl for the sample doll. Written instructions for this doll will appear eventually in Country Knitting of Maine News and Views magazine. This is a super project to do with children and for beginners because the knitting is very, very simple. And each piece of knitting is very small. The skills are super basic. All the interesting character comes from a little bit of hand finishing, and none of it is difficult. Happy knitting!